So choosing to care means making a conscious decision to search for meaning. And I want to tell you now just three quick personal stories. As I mentioned to you, I'm a family caregiver, and that really is something that didn't just happen once, but 3 times. When I was young, I grew up in a family with 4 children. My father was an engineer. He was a very demanding man. He was very hard on his kids, on his work, on the people he worked with. He was difficult. He had a furious temper. He was irascible. And when things didn't go his way, he would explode. Everyone in my family feared my dad. And that was okay, because he also had a wonderful side. He taught me much. I was his little apprentice when I was a young boy. And he would all the chores in the house, he would show me. He would teach me things. And I loved him for that. But as I got to be a teenager, our relationship grew very cold, and I challenged him. And from the time that I was 16 until I left for college, my father and I only fought. And we really had no positive relationship. We fought in a very negative way. I went away to college, and 5 years later, I came home. Now, my father died at a very young age. He had diabetes, and it was a very brittle form of diabetes. All my life, I watched my mother take care of my father with diabetes. But it became a very serious illness for him toward the end of his life. In the last 5 years, he had 2 amputations. He lost both legs. He became blind. He had high blood pressure, and his heart was failing. And it was into that context that I came home. Now, everyone else had left. My mother was there taking care of my father, who had now been forced out of work, was home, and was a bitter man. But illness had changed him, too. He no longer had that furious temper. He was humbled. He was actually lonely. He was sad. He was worried about what his life all meant. He had become very introspective. And it was into that situation that I came, and for 2 years became the primary caregiver for my dad. And the meaning that I shaped around that was that I was going to use this time to learn about my father. He told me stories about growing up, about his childhood I had never heard. I learned more about my dad's views in those 2 years than my whole childhood. I learned about what he thought about God. Where was he going when he died? And I taught him things too. I taught him that he could have a dramatic impact on people, even from the wheelchair, even with no legs, by simply demonstrating that he had overcome those challenges and by becoming a gentler person. And he did that. He learned to do that. He wanted me to teach him how to meditate. And we did. And we went out to ball games, and I took him everywhere for 2 years. And to this day, when I tell my siblings that I had this experience with my father at the end of his life, and we became close friends, they don't believe me. They still don't. They remember my father, who was a tyrant. And I had the experience of my father in a very different way. Experience of someone who had been humbled by chronic illness, but had grown through it. Several years later, my wife and I were married. We had 3 small children. And we invited my mother-in-law to live with us. I was teaching. I had a small salary. We had 3 small kids. And having Grandma, who the kids loved, in our home, we had a big enough home, was really wonderful. For 10 years, we lived together. And my girls, 3 daughters, grew up with 2 parents and a grandmother. And they loved her dearly. They learned a great deal. They loved to go in there and be spoiled. They loved to talk to her about her childhood. And so it was enriching. Well, Vera had emphysema. And Vera, my mother-in-law, became very ill. And the last 5 years of her life really were challenging. She needed oxygen. She needed to be in a wheelchair. Emphysema is a terrible illness. It causes a huge strain on your heart. And so any anxiety, if you get nervous, you can't breathe. Lack of oxygen causes pain. Morphine is used to moderate the effects. Now, Vera said to us, to our family, she said, the one thing that I don't want is to spend the last days of my life in a hospital or a nursing home. And yet that's what the doctors were recommending to us. So we got together as a family, and we had to make that decision. And I met with my daughters and my wife, and we said, what are we going to do? And they all said, we're going to take care of Grandma at home. One of my daughters took a year off from school. She was in 10th grade. In the United States, you can be homeschooled. And that was a tough decision for me. But today, that daughter, by the way, is a geriatric nurse. She learned a lot, right? The family, and the kids in particular, took care of my mother-in-law 24/7 for 3 years. In the last 6 months of her life, she required hospice, and we invited hospice in. We invited them in, and we learned everything we could from them. I don't know if Singapore has a hospice program. So you're aware that it's a wonderful program, and it allows people to live at home and die at home. And that's what Vera wanted. So we picked our partners very carefully. And we learned. We learned everything we could about managing. There were all kinds of sprays and procedures and oxygen and lots of things. And the administration of morphine is not easy either. There were bad moments. There were moments when we thought we were wrong to do this. And people told us she needs to be in the hospital. But for 3 years, we avoided every crisis. We avoided hospitalization. And that last night, when Vera died at 4 a.m., all of her granddaughters and my wife and I were around that bed. And we had done it. You know, Vera was going to die at home with no tubes. She was in her own environment. And we stayed with her all night. And, my mother-in-law was a Roman Catholic. And at a certain point in the night, she looked out the window and she saw the Virgin Mary, who was her patron. And we knew she was at peace. When she died, we didn't call the coroner for 2 hours. We sat with Vera. And we called then the coroner, the minister, all the responsible parties. But to this day, it's one of the great achievements of my family that we were able to give this woman her wish to be at home. And we managed, and we fought off all of the people who told us it was wrong. That she needed, we could prolong her life for another week if she went in the hospital. We knew Vera didn't want that.